Hello. As you can see, I am not your normal host. This is African Women Must Lead with Yejide Orunmila. It's a live monthly political program from the African National Women's Organization. And today I am your host and MC. My name is Je Amaechi, and we're going to be talking about gender as a colonial construct, which I know is a controversial subject, but I'm excited to get into it. So, yeah, first and foremost, I want to talk about why it's important we talk about this. I'm sure people are tired of talking about the gender wars and all that stuff, and I am also tired of all of that, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's Pride Month, and in honor of our our non-binary ancestors and transcestors, be talking to you about this topic, and also in honor of women and men that didn't necessarily adhere to the colonial norms. So those folks are who I'm dedicating this program to, and I'm excited to get into this topic. So yeah, so one thing I want to say is that it's really important to learn about different genders and gender outside the colonial construct because as displaced indigenous and colonized people, we need to work to revive and reclaim our cultural heritage, and that includes different gender roles and identities. And so when we think about cultural survival and self-determination, we really need to think about how did we live before colonization. So one thing I think is important to talk about as well is specifically the family and the role that the family plays in capitalism. And so with the family, Engels had his what was it? He had his book. It was called the Essay on the Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, and he talks a lot about how the family structure, the nuclear family structure, is basically the economic foundation, of capitalism. And so this idea of this nuclear family arose to control women's reproductive labor. And so both Marx and Engels, they talk about how the oppression of women was very closely tied to the rise of private property and class society. When you think about inheritance, right? Children, who's having the babies that are inheriting the property and the status. And so they believed that the development of capitalism really exacerbated gender inequalities by reducing women's roles to the domestic sphere and making them economically dependent on men. And Engels specifically, he talks about the evolution of the family through a bunch of different stages. So he talks first about the primitive communal family, which was characterized by group marriage and collective child rearing. And this is something that we see all throughout, pre-colonial African culture and African culture to this day. The quote, "It takes a village to raise a family," right? And so this idea of like one man, one woman, and then 2.5 kids, that is a new thing. That's not something that has been around for a very long time. And eventually things moved on, and things moved on from this communal family structure to this pairing, husband and wife and monogamous family. And those that family structure was really closely tied to the colonial mode of production. It's directly tied, as I mentioned, to property relations. And when I say that it's tied to property relations, it's about inheritance and legitimate heirs. And so the family, the nuclear family, was actually created to establish dominance and to control women, but also to control land and labor. Um, and also thinking about like the economic function of the family. Um, the family is basically an economic unit, and it has this role in reproducing labor power, right? So women are producing workers, right? And so the way the family structure exists now is basically designed to produce, mindless workers and to reproduce the ideology that upholds capitalism. And so it's really essential. Like this type of family was essential for, the socialization and upbringing of children in a very specific way that upheld capitalism. And so, not to mention, there's this what they call the, sexual division of labor. So, women are often doing unpaid domestic work, while men are in wage labor. And yeah, men doing wage labor was dependent on women doing domestic work. You know how, you work 40 hours a week and you get home from work and you're like, I have to cook, I have to clean, I have to do all these things. And you just wonder to yourself, like, how did people do this? That's how I think. I'm like, how did people do this forever? Just work for 40 hours and then, wake up early to cook breakfast and, lunch, and then get home and make dinner and cook and clean. And I don't even have kids. So, if you have kids, you have to like bathe your kids, take care of your kids, you have to get them to school, all of that while doing a 40-hour a week job. Um, the reason why it's structured that way is because they never expected people to do both. The expectation was that men are going to go home and go to work, and that men will go to work and women will be home taking care of the house, raising the children, making the meals, cleaning, all of that. Like there was never this expectation that we would do both. And that's why probably, uh, we all feel so tired at the end of every day and tired at the end of every week, because we have so much yeah, I mean, we have so much to do between our labor and the or the domestic labor. And often domestic labor is not even acknowledged or recognized. So, um, you know, specifically, I want to move away from talking about the family and talk about like binary thinking in general, right? So, binary thinking, it's a cognitive framework, and basically it simplifies complex phenomena into two opposing categories, like A or B, black or white, with nothing in between. And it creates this dichotomy, right? And there's just two distinct, mutually exclusive things. Um, and this type of thinking, has been used as a tool for colonial systems to enforce rigid categories and to maintain controls. And so when dominant culture simplifies identities and behaviors into binaries, then it's easier to impose like social hierarchies and to justify inequality. One thing I think it's important to think about is the erasure of complex identities. Um, Pre-colonial Africa had, a range of identities, and when the colonizers came, they did not like that, obviously. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, about the different gender identities that existed before colonization. So, binary thinking, it reduces the complexity of human identities and experiences and relationships into these opposing categories. And it really does not capture the rich diversity of human existence. From tribe to tribe, from continent to continent, from country to country, nation to nation, there is a rich diversity of experience. And that includes people's relationship with gender. And for those that didn't fit really neatly into that category, for example, people that were more gender fluid or people that were intersex, they were often, maybe erased or marginalized and oftentimes even killed. And so their identities are not just invalidated, they also get this, physical harm often, in addition to like social and psychological harm. And binary thinking, it supports hierarchical structure, and it can create this division between us and them. So thinking about like the culture wars, men versus women, like that is part of the binary thinking. Um, and it's really the foundation of a lot of oppressive systems like white supremacy. And it's also, this kind of thinking can be used to discriminate against people. So when there's these rigid categories, it provides this rationale for excluding people. Oh, you don't fit in this box or this box, therefore you don't get anything. You don't get to be here at all. And it just legitimizes unequal treatment based on like the perceived differences in terms of gender. So another thing I wanted to mention was about how binary thinking and or colonial expressions of gender really pressure individuals to conform to really predefined roles and expectations. So men go to work, women stay home. Men are strong and you know and forceful or angry, and women are soft and meek. These kind of binaries people were basically forced into, and people that would not be forced into that, people that deviated from those norms, often faced ostracism, violence, and legal repercussions as well. But before the colonizers came, we had all different expressions of women. There were women queens and women kings even, and so women weren't just meek or soft. They weren't just staying home. They were a big part of African society. They ruled things. They were part of the world in a way that the colonial understanding of women is not the case. Um, and it's a really limited perspective, this kind of binary thinking. It really prevents us from like appreciating the full complexity of things like gender. And it can stifle cultural growth by dismissing ideas that don't conform to this binary. And it's like polarizing as well. I mentioned before, like the culture war, and this kind of polarizing thinking, it really fosters conflict and division, and so it prevents like the working class and from joining together and uh, basically throwing off the chains of the ruling class. Like it's one of many ways that we're divided in order to keep us from throwing off our colonial chains. um, and I'm talking about this binary thinking because obviously I want to talk about the gender binary and how it enforces strict roles for men and women. Um, and I want to talk about the cultural norms that exist, and how gender is related to those. For example, thinking about um, uh, like racial purity, and thinking about yeah, all different things. Like there's these norms that are also associated with gender and colonialism, and they're tied together. Um, yeah, so another thing I wanted to talk about was basically when the colonizers came to the Americas. They obviously had their ideas about the way society was supposed to be. They had their uh, rigid ideas about gender. They had Christianity. They had their Christian belief. They had all of that. And so when they come over to the Americas, they're basically just shocked by what they see. They're just outraged. Diego Alvarez Chanca, who accompanied Columbus, he wrote in this letter in 1494. He talks about the Carib people, and he talks about this habit of young men who would remove their masculine organs and develop feminine characteristics. And he, of course, was horrified by this. And in 1511, another colonizer, Peter Martyr Dangira, he published this book. It was called De Orbe Novos Decades. And basically, he talks about how when he was on the Isthmus of Panama, he sees, some young men, the brother of the king, and young men who were dressed effeminately and wearing women's clothes. And the result of that was the colonizers threw 40 of those men as food to the dogs. They were torn apart by dogs. This is how outraged they were by it. They considered this like, they considered not sticking to this gender binary to be this sin against God, and this like this mortal sin, and around 1526, we have Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, and he talks about the diabolical practices, the diabolical practices of a man marrying another man. Like that sounds almost absurd, like, oh, it's so diabolical. Um, but he talks about these effeminate, impotent men that dress like women and they perform women's duties. But they also, in addition to performing women's duties, they fired a bow and arrow. They carried a lot of loads. They were doing like heavy physical labor. And oftentimes, these folks, these, effeminate, non-binary folks, they were actually taller and sturdier than, the other men, like the men that identified strictly as men. And so when he sees this, he again is just like, the colonizers are just in shock, and of course they persecute the indigenous people because of, their beliefs around how gender should be. And in 1526, there was another book that was written. It was called The Natural History of the Indies, by Fernandez de Oviedo. That's how you pronounce it, I think. Oviedo. Fernandez de Oviedo. And he talks about how, very common, these youths, they wear naguas, which are skirts. They wear naguas like women, and they wear strings of beads and bracelets and other things used by women as adornment. But they do not use weapons. They do not do anything proper to men, and they occupy the house in ways and do chores in ways that are customary for women. And so he notices this, and he's so upset about it that he has to write back to, the Queen of Spain about, the degeneracy that he sees. And just a couple years later, Friar Gregorio Garcia, he's writing back home talking about, like, some men are dressed as women, and some fathers had 5 sons that dressed him as a woman and instructed him in the way of women's work and married him as a woman. And so the colonizers wrote many, many things about, how they were just horrified by indigenous and non-colonial forms of gender. And of course, that wasn't just in, like, most of those examples I gave were in South America. And there were many other examples all over the world. In North America, there was this book that was written in 1850 about the Crow Nation. And, the author talks about, like, males that assume the dress and perform the duties of females, and women turn men. And they mate. They talk about how they mate with their own sex, and the ethnographer Leslie Spiel also noticed in the Pacific Northwest, where I live, amongst the Klamath tribe, that there were called birdaches, and men and women who, reasons that are, like, sort of lost to this day, which, maybe they didn't have reasons, maybe they just felt like they wanted to do it, but they take on the dress and the habits of, the opposite sex. And so, besides the Americas, obviously we're Africans, and it's important to talk about non-binary identities within African culture. So, in Kenya, for example, there was the Mashoga. Well, not just Kenya, but the Swahili-speaking areas around the Kenyan coast. There's the Mashoga people, in the Mombasa people in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's the Mangaika people. In southern Ethiopia, there is the Ashtime people, and the Ashtime people in particular, they were usually people that were assigned male at birth, but who actually identified as women. Sometimes, they were eunuchs, but they basically were living in the homes of the most powerful spiritual or political leaders, because women were not allowed to enter, but they occupied the role as women, and assumed women's duties in place of women who could not necessarily join that space. Um, and then there's also in Ethiopia, there's the Nur people, who, they not only dress feminine, but they acted feminine, and they're, like, generally were regarded as having, like, become a woman. There was no physical sex changes at the time, really. I mean, there was castration, I guess, which counts, but they didn't have any physical changes, but they still were free to occupy this feminine identity, the feminine role, and even were able to, marry a man. And there was this prophet of Dang who consulted spirits, and he would declare the change in the individual status. Basically, he would consult the spirits to basically affirm, that this person's gender has changed. Um, and besides Ethiopia, we have spiritual figures in the Dogon religion. So there's these twins. Twins are sacred in a lot of cultures, but and twins often represent duality. And so with these specific twins in the Dogon religion, they were named Nomo, and it's Numo and Nomo is what they're named, and they were actually the same person. And I thought that was interesting to think about. And this is interesting to understand the Dogon conception of gender. They have this idea that, like, in the beginning, everything was dual birth. There was a twin male and a twin female, and everyone and everything is born with this duality and given a twin soul. And this is symbolized by androgyny, which is in their art and their in a lot of different cultural things that they had. They had this blending of masculine and feminine, and they thought of that world, that like androgynous world, that world of of kind of a non-binary, I guess you could say, identity. They thought of that as the ideal world, as the world before things got all kind of messed up. um, which reminds me of, in Yoruba culture, we often talk about how Olodumare, the Most High Creator God, is beyond gender. He doesn't occupy, I'm referring to him as he, but like they don't occupy the male or female gender. They're both, and also neither. They transcend gender, and they encompass all things, all forces, all energy. And also in the Yoruba tradition, there's a number of Orisha that have, masculine and feminine traits that, depending on the tradition, sometimes are depicted in different ways. And so Olokun, for example, he's one of the gods of the deep sea, and Olokun is often depicted as either a man or a woman or both. And uh, Besides that, I mentioned the twins, and so there's this the twins, representing the interplay of both male and female. Um, and besides that, there's also in let's see, in Burkina Faso and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, there's the Dagaba people, and there's a shaman. Her name's Malidoma Somé, and this shaman says that gender is not gender to this tribe of the Dagaba people is not dependent on anatomy. It is purely energetic. So in that context, uh, a physical male can vibrate a female energy and vice versa. And say that's where the real gender is what is said. And there's also the Chibados, which is a third gender people who are often born men but live as women, and they're found amongst the cultures of the Ndogan people, which is today Angola. And they were first described by the Portuguese, and they are often seen as these like spiritual arbiters in political and military decisions. And they would perform different ceremonies, like burials, for example. Some of the colonizers would describe Chibados as these shamans who walk dressed as women and would marry other men. And of course, the Portuguese priests and the Jesuits were just like, they were not having it. They were not into that, And they wrote about how these marriages were often honored and even prized. And of course, that was like beyond them. They could not even fathom that people would allow people to marry the same gender, that they would allow people to have different forms of gender outside of the binary, maybe a third gender or neither gender, that kind of fluidity. The priests and the Jesuits, they were not having it. And many people know about Queen Nzinga of Ndogo and Matamba. She's famous because there basically was this. Basically, she fought against the Portuguese. She's a amazing warrior woman, and obviously, as this sort of warrior, she was not necessarily occupying the colonial understandings of gender. And they tried to humble her. They really wanted to humble her as a woman, humble her as an African, because they did not see her as equal because of her Africanness and also because of her womanness. And there's a famous story where they talk about how there's a famous story where they talk about how she was going to meet the Portuguese to basically they had been fighting and they were trying to, I think, negotiate. And when she showed up to negotiate with the Portuguese, there was only one chair, and the colonizer was sitting in it. So she had no place to sit, and the goal was to make her sit on the floor in front of this man. And the story is famous because, of course, she did not do that. Instead, she had one of her male guards get on his hands and knees, and she used him as a chair. And of course, the Portuguese were just so outraged by this. And I think that is like a really interesting story. And it really shows how, this conception of gender and traditional gender roles was just something that wasn't like that in that society. And the colonizers really wanted to impose these kind of colonial gender norms onto people. But we resisted. And Queen Nzinga is an example of that. And Queen Nzinga, she had over 50 of the Chibados, which I mentioned are like third gender people. She had over 50 in her court. And they say that, she might have even used some of them as concubines, which I think is interesting. But, the point is, I'm bringing up all these different examples because it's important to really point out the arrival and the suffocating influence of Christianity on the continent, and to be fair, somewhat Islam as well, but I mean Islam less so, but definitely Christianity. They really enforce these suffocating, very rigid gender roles that made it dangerous for people that didn't fit into that binary, and it was a way that they chose to. It's how they justify the subordination of people. So they demonize them and to say they're doing these unnatural things and that they're going against God and all these other things, and then they would say, we need to bring Christianity to them. We need to force Christianity onto them in order to purge them of these kind of like demonic, entities. And you know, um, it's interesting to think about all of these examples that have existed throughout indigenous cultures and pre-Columbian cultures since God knows how long, thousands of years. I think it's interesting to talk about and important to talk about them because people act like non-binary identities are something that is brand new, that is something that, the colonizer invented. That's like a Western invention. But in fact, non-binary identities and gender fluid identities have always existed, and they were, often and usually seen as, vital and contributing members of their societies, and they're often viewed as sacred, or they were part of, the military command or part of the court. And so, even within Europe, it's not new. I was thinking about there was this thing called the Western Rising of 1628 through 1631. And it was a rebellion in southwest England against the enclosure of royal forests. And basically, there was this protest movement, and the leader adopted the name Lady Skimmington. And, sources say that it wasn't actually just one person, that Lady Skimmington was actually a number of men that were involved in this uprising, and they were all dressed as women. And they were dressed as women, not just as disguise, because they were trying to disguise themselves, but they were also doing it to symbolize their protest against, the established order, the powers that be. And I mentioned the Western Rising because it's so important to think, in terms of capitalism, about how the enclosure of the commons was a huge part of the primitive accumulation. And so, land back in the day, land used to be managed communally. And that's how, they have these stories about how indigenous people in the US would accept these, like, shells or something in exchange for, like, for example, the island of Manhattan. And for them, they weren't like, and for us, in our Western society, people might think like, well, that's dumb. They traded like a whole island, a giant island, for basically something they could probably get themselves. But the way that they saw it as the colonizers were the stupid ones, because they were like, you can't own land. Like, it's land. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's the earth. We belong to the earth. The earth does not belong to us. And so, as they're enclosing the commons, as they're pushing people off the land, where are those people going? To the cities. And what do those people become? They become the workers that power the Industrial Revolution. And so, I think it's just interesting to think about how, this protest, dressing up, men dressing up in women's clothes, how that was a protest against the natural order, and how it was related to the enclosure of the commons, which was the prerequisite for capitalism to even exist. And again, I mentioned before that one of the functions of the nuclear family is to maintain private property, to create inheritance. And so all of this, is wrapped up together. And hopefully, I'm explaining it in a way that people understand. But feel free to, throw some questions in the chat, or think about your questions and ask some later, because I know I'm going kind of fast, probably because I'm a little nervous. But if you have questions, let me know. And so, just to get back in it, I think it's also interesting to mention William Dorsey Swan, from 1880 and the 1890s. So he was a formerly enslaved man, and he actually organized a series of drag balls in DC. He actually called himself the Queen of Drag. And a lot of the attendees of these gatherings, most of them were formerly enslaved people. And they would come and dance in like silk and satin dresses, and this was known as the House of Swan. And to this day, we talk about, like, or in ballroom culture, there's the house of this, the house of that, and that really came from Dorsey. And these were really secretive events, and they would do things called the cakewalk, which I don't know if you know what that is, but the cakewalk is a dance performed by enslaved folks, and they were basically mimicking the mannerisms of the plantation owners. And so they would often mimic the mannerisms of the plantation owners, and also the wives of the plantation owners. And they would use these improvisational movements and these subtle expressions of communication. And that actually became what we know today as voguing, which voguing was, a dance style of trans and non-binary people that was popularized in Harlem. And it was trans and non-binary Black people, I should say, that created this, that popularized voguing. And besides that, in the early 19th century, there were cross-dressing workers that led a lot of early labor struggles against the growth of capitalism. So, defying the gender binary has always, in a way, been tied to, defying capitalism and defying the current order. And so, when we think about gender roles and like traditional gender roles, by adhering to these gender roles, in a rigid, completely rigid way, we're actually, reinforcing the colonial mode of production, because the colonial mode of production could not exist, without capitalism, and capitalism could not exist without the separation between the domestic sphere of labor and the economic sphere of labor. And that dichotomy between the two spheres of labor could not exist unless there were strict gender roles that men and women had to occupy. And I'm bringing all this up not to say that like everybody needs to be non-binary, or everybody needs to you know adopt the clothes of the opposite sex or anything like that. I'm just bringing it up to say that yeah, this form of resistance has always been tied to colonialism and capitalism. Another thing that is really interesting is um, I mentioned earlier that queerness and transness and these non-binary gender fluid identities, they're often assumed to be a colonial import. They're part of the excesses and the deviance of the West. And so we actually see sometimes transphobia and queerphobia, homophobia, um, factor into these supposed like decolonial movements, which is a shame. And it's as I mentioned before, there's a long history of gender fluidity in African culture, but there was this sort of bait and switch where conservative groups would come into Africa, and they still to this day come into Africa and say, "Oh, if you don't want to be like these, Western people, you have to uh, make these things illegal. You need to do the death penalty for queer folks." And people believe that. They think that by rejecting gender fluidity, they're rejecting colonialism, and by adhering to very strict gender roles, that they're rejecting again colonialism. And it's to some extent it's a little bit understandable because of rainbow capitalism. um, Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously because maybe people don't know this, but the reason why Pride even exists is because of the Stonewall riots, that were led by Black queer people. And the Stonewall riots where police were came into the Stonewall Inn, and people were just chilling and drinking and doing what they do like at bars. The police raided and they started a riot. They threw a brick at the police and it started this whole thing. And to this day, this is why we celebrate Pride. It had this revolutionary beginning. But if you go to a Pride march now, you would never think that, right? It's all, Pride sponsored by Citibank, by Absolute Vodka, by this, by that. And so, it kind of makes sense that people, some people in, continental Africa right now see queerness and gender fluidity as this colonial import, because rainbow capitalism is something that's still exploiting people. It's still upholding capitalism, and this is what capitalism does, right? It takes in things that were formerly deviant in order to neutralize them. And so we saw that with the women's liberation movement, right? And so the women's liberation movement was doing great things, specifically in the Soviet Union, where they had legalized abortion, and they legalized birth control and homosexuality. They legalized all these things in the 20s, or like not the 20s, so the 30s. It was like long before it was legalized in the U.S. And to this day, it's not really legal everywhere in the U.S. But the funny thing is that the Soviet Union had done all of those things under communism, and so they associated gender equality. They would associate back in the day gender equality and women's liberation with communism, for good reason, because like as basically, not adhering to these gender binaries is a threat to colonialism, and it's a threat to capitalism. And the funny thing is about how the Soviet Union had all of these great changes for women, and they enrolled women in school, and they had all women that were educated, and they increased the literacy rate, and they did all of that. And they did all of that without this moniker of the feminist movement. They did that long before the feminist movement even existed. And so women would start to notice, like and the women in the US were like, hey, actually in the Soviet Union, and not just women, workers as well. All of the little caveats and the little the thing, they just basically gave us a little piece of crumbs of rights so we don't fight, and that's what happened. That's basically what the feminist movement is, right? It is a co-optation of the women's liberation movement. It co-opted it and neutralized it. And so now, you have people saying like Hillary Clinton is a feminist, and you have this pink capitalism and like girl boss feminism, and all these things that actually reproduce the colonial mode of production, which the colonial mode of production disproportionately harms women and children. And so that's funny to me how people are talking about feminism and trying to say that like this has to be everywhere. And at the end of the day, they're reinforcing these colonial norms. And like I said, that disproportionately hurts like women and children on the continent. Um, and the women's liberation movement it was a powerhouse. It was, you know, changing everything. And of course, colonizers, they don't want that. They don't want women um, to have any of the rights that men have enjoyed. But when you think about what the feminist movement actually is, or how it started with white women demanding to be equal to white men. And for me, and for a lot of us, I'm assuming the goal is not to be like white men. It's not to assimilate within the colonial empire. The goal is to destroy the colonial empire. So, back in the day, you had women that were trying to get the right to vote, but they did not include black people, black men. They didn't include black women either in that right to vote. Sorry, my cat is in the way. Um, and so that was like the suffragette movement, which was, the precursor to the feminist movement. And then, later on, you have this movement for women to in the workplace, which kind of sounds absurd, to us because black women have always worked. When have black women never worked? Like that was so irrelevant to us. But again, it's about assimilating into the capitalist colonial empire. Um, yeah. So, I mentioned before that transness and queerness and gender fluidity was assumed to be a colonial export, and so we're seeing this effect to this day. In Uganda, for example. I think it was the prime minister, one of the politicians, his name's Museveni. 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 He basically was praising Uganda's parliament for defying imperialist pressures. Um, but at the end of the day, that was actually the opposite of what was happening, because more than 20 evangelical Christian groups um, have spent at least $54 million in Africa since 2007, and they're spending this to basically create a U.S. style culture war in Africa, and it's working. So they're framing like this homophobia and transphobia and resistance to fluid identities. They're framing that as like resistance to neocolonialism, when in fact, yeah, it's very much the opposite. Like I mentioned, many African societies, they were very open to gender fluidity and different roles. And it was actually the colonizer that came in and erased all of that. And thinking about like British colonial laws, which criminalize homosexuality all over the continent, and also as an aside, people talk a lot about how like Palestine, for example, they talk about how, oh, just you as queer people go to Palestine and see what it's like, see if you get beheaded, see if this and that. First of all, there's never been a case ever of people being beheaded for their sexuality in Palestine. But also the rules against homosexuality were established by the British. They are leftover British colonial laws. And it's the same thing in Uganda and all over parts of Africa. There's British colonial laws that criminalize homosexuality, and those laws are still on the books to this day. Um, so, someone asked about, I'll put it on here. Is it safe to say, no, it's not quite Q&A yet, but I was going to talk about this anyways. So is it safe to say that African spirituality embraced gender binary until it was corrupted by religion? I guess it depends on what you mean by religion, because religion could be African. There's African religions and that kind of thing, but in every tribe had a different understanding of spirituality, and they also had a different understanding of identity. Which, because of that different understanding of identity, they had a different understanding of gender binaries, and they had different understanding of gender roles. So there was no one way of being within the tribes. Like, there were so many different ways of being. Um, and so, I don't know, I don't really know the answer to this question, but I would say that in many African tribes, the gender fluidity was, was celebrated. And when they did talk about, men and women, it wasn't a binary, right? It was a plurality. It was a what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, it was talk about them both at the same time. It wasn't just like this thing over here versus this thing over here, like this very black and white thinking. There was a lot of overlap. Um, and yeah, so so African spiritual beliefs, they would talk about gender transformation, and that they talked about gender transformation amongst the Akan, the Ambo, the Bobo, the Dahomians, the Dogon, the Bambara, the Handa, the Hunde, the Igbo, the Jukun. Like, there's so many. The list goes on and on. There are many different African spiritual traditions that believe in either intersex, like as in both genders, deities, or gender transformation, like the deity will change from one gender to another. And so that was part of this, the spiritual tradition. And in Mali, the Dogon tribe in particular, they talked about how the perfect human is androgynous. And I mentioned the twins, and so they worship these spirits, these ancestral spirits that are described as androgynous or intersex. They're basically like mystical beings, and they're often referred to as like the teachers, which reminds me how in a lot of indigenous cultures in the U.S. as well, it was often the two spirit people, as they're called, that would be seen as spiritual leaders and be seen as sacred. Um, and the Zapotecs, so I don't know if folks are familiar with the Zapatistas, but basically the Zapatistas are a decolonial movement in Mexico, where they are an autonomous territory, an autonomous indigenous territory. They set up their own government. They set up their own schools and rule of law. They set up everything. They rejected the colonizers' traditions and laws and ways of being, in favor of creating their own structure and their own system. And they're really interesting because I think they're an amazing model for how we might do something like that today. How different communities can throw off the shackles of the colonizer. And they did this, obviously through armed resistance. And one of my favorite things, and I wish I thought to do this earlier, to look up the pictures of them, but I used to have as part of, I had a collage as my background of all these women warriors, and I loved the Zapatistas. They would wear these like skull cap things, or like bandanas over their faces with these like giant guns, and like they would defended their territory. And so the Zapotec people are the people that are basically part of the Zapatistas. The Zapotec is the name of the tribe, and the Zapatistas is more like the political organization. So the Zapotecs, they had this third gender, and that gender was called Muxi, and it was basically an intermediate between men and women. And that they would play both gender roles in life, and they still exist to this day. They still are a crucial part of the community to this very day. And they're embraced as part of the rejection of, the colonial legacy, um, that they experience in Mexico, which Mexico right now, has, like the U.S., has very, very strict gender norms. And this is as a result of, Catholic and Christian ideology, which, as people probably know, was forced onto people as a means of severing people's connection to the divine, severing their connection to the land, because land, it was always a huge part of many indigenous spiritual traditions. And so instead of like having this connection with the land where my hands are in it and I feel the deep connection, this material, it was almost all indigenous spiritualities and religions are material based. They're based on um, the land, the animals, all different plants, the things that exist in this world, and those things are spiritual. But you can touch them, you can see them. They are physical, material things. Um, but the Christian belief is that, there's a separation, right? There's hierarchy, and that again has to do with the gender roles. So, there's man on the bottom, and then there's God up here, and there's that separation between man and God, and that separation will never end until we die, and only after we die do we get to actually be up there with the mysterious God up there, which is very, different from African spiritualities, where we think about our ancestors are with us all the time, and all the different deities are with us all the time. It's not like, we die and then we could see, all these things. We can talk to them right now. We can talk to them every day, through our altars and different practices. Um, yeah, so there's a separation between man and God, right? And that separation, that hierarchy between man and God, was reflected in the hierarchy between men and women. So go God on top, and then men below God, and then women below men, and then children below women. And so in our society, in currently our society, children have virtually no rights. They are basically just subject and beholden to their parents, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why the CPS system is so strong. It's intentional. Like, they don't want children to have rights, because they want to indoctrinate children. The colonizers, they want to indoctrinate children young, and they want that control over children. Um, yeah. So um, yeah. Uh, Another thing I wanted to mention, yeah, well, it's actually getting a little bit close to 6 o'clock, but yeah, the last thing I want to say is that it's just really important to understand that um, the way that our ancestors understood gender is not the way that the culture wars understand gender. And the culture wars are a distraction. The man versus women. Do you tip? Do you pay on a date? Do you serve this person's plate first? Like, all of this is immaterial. All of this does not matter. All the Twitter fights and the TikTok fights about men versus women, and that they are a distraction, and they are distraction, and they're separation on purpose in order to prevent us from rising up. And so, when women see, all men as oppressors, that is a flattening of experiences. And men have a variety of experiences. And the same thing, when women see women in a specific way, that flattens their experience. And I think specifically about, in places like in Palestine, and throughout history, and throughout slavery in the US, they use the assumptions about men in order to persecute specifically colonized men. So, there was this assumption that men could not control their urges, and that they were aggressive. And so they would paint Black men in that exact way, and lynch them. And then they would have, these white women who were presumed to be, innocent and soft, who weaponized this perception of women against men in service of white supremacy, in service of colonization. So, when you see people having these gender war things, first of all, like, I know it's tempting, and I've definitely been there to jump in the conversation and say your piece. Like like some of these things are so ridiculous that it's so tempting to just jump in there and say something. But I would just say that it's so important to recognize that these culture wars, like this way of understanding gender, is part of the colonial mode of production. It is part of how we are maintaining a separation between genders instead of coming together and um, throwing off the chains of capitalism. And we saw a lot in Burkina Faso, and with also with Cabral, and these different leaders, these revolutionary leaders. Some of the first things that they did were to raise the status of women, to raise the literacy rate, to put them in schools, and do all of these things. And as soon as these revolutionary governments were toppled, then women went right back to this lowly status. And so it's important to understand that when we have, like, when we're fighting against the colonial mode of production, when we're resisting colonization, we have to also resist the identities that are put onto us. We need to be thinking about, like, how do I identify outside of the colonial mode of production? Because the colonizer will tell you that you have to identify this way in order to exploit you. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to identify that way. And also, it's okay to identify also with your gender, and it's just about flexibility and about understanding that there's not one way of being. There's not one way of being a man. There's not one way of being a woman, and that there's a lot of fluidity that has always existed and will continue to exist. And the only reason why we're seeing this like queer capitalism and pink capitalism is because capitalism co-ops radical movements. And so the queer liberation was a radical movement against police, which, as we know, police are the lapdogs of capital. They are the attack dogs of the ruling class. And now we see cops marching at Pride. And I was just looking at this video I saw a couple days ago, where basically there was a Pride protest happening, and a lot of queer folks that are for Palestine were disrupting the parade. And the police are beating and doing all this stuff, hitting and trying to arrest and the queer folks that are for Palestine, in order to have this like capitalist parade with all of these corporate sponsors. And so police are in there just like trying to maintain this white supremacist, this dominant mode of thinking, even within queer culture. And so with that said, before we go into Q&A, just want to quickly do our announcements, which give me a second while I bring this up. It's going to take me one moment. And all right. Okay. Apologies for the delay. Okay. All right. Let me share the screen. All right. So here are our announcements. Okay. So, yeah, of course, join ANWO. It is the only anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolutionary organization for Black women. So the link is over there, anwohuru.org/join. Yeah, donate today. So if tonight's program has inspired you, we call on you to join the organization, and also to donate as well. So ANWO is leading on everyday issues concerning African women. And we're not just on the internet, we're in the ground or on the ground, organizing for African liberation. So yeah, join this international collective, donate to us. Let me play this. Oops. I don't know if I can play this video. Give me 1 second. All right. Play this video real.
The African National Women's Organization Liberation Center is an ambitious initiative born from the vision to transform 4617 Natural Bridge Avenue into a vibrant facility. This space, generously donated by the African People's Education and Defense Fund, will become a working-class embassy, a hub for community empowerment, and a testament to the resilience of African people. But we can't achieve this vision alone. We need your support to bring this dream. Your donation toward our goal of raising $60,227 will fund the comprehensive rehabilitation of the property. Why should you donate? Because every contribution brings us one step closer to providing working-class African women with a property of their own, a place where they can heal, organize, and thrive. Why are we doing this? Because we are committed to advancing the cause of African self-determination. Our center will provide vital cultural, social, and community spaces that celebrate African people and serve as a catalyst for change. Additionally, as the headquarters of the African National Women's Organization, the center will serve as a national and local organizing space empowering African women and femmes in our struggles against the impact of colonial capitalism. Your support can make a profound difference in our efforts to uplift African women and femmes. Join us in our mission to strengthen our community, nurture resilience, and pave the way for a brighter, more equitable future. Together, we can ensure that the flame of African self-determination burns brighter than ever before. To donate and to learn more about the project, visit bit.ly/AnnualCenter1.
All right, yeah, so hope you enjoyed that video. Show us some material solidarity by funding the Liberation Center of African Women. And, as I think the video mentioned, support the rehabilitation of historic St. Louis, the Black community there. And they're working on an international headquarters, and that's what this center is. And besides that, there's also the One Africa, One Nation Flea and Farmers Market, and that's to support African economic development. And there's other events all over the country. ANWO is an organization of African poor and working class, so we need your support to make these things happen. And if you can't become a member, consider becoming a sustaining donor. Don't wait till the program ends. Pledge your support now. And with donation levels starting at $5 a month, start or renew your support today. We also accept one-time donations of any amount. Wear your politics with ANWO. ANWO's shop features t-shirts, sweatshirts, travel bags, mugs, hoodies, and even socks. Profits from the merch sales support the campaigns of ANWO, including Arrest CPS, Uhuru Kijiji Child Care Collective, and the War Council. Become a decolonizer and support ANWO Economic Development Project, Decolonize Hair and Body. Decolonize Hair and Body are natural personal products that highlight ingredients and traditional care practices used by Indigenous people around the world, in addition to featuring images and quotes of African revolutionaries. And they are really good, definitely amazing. From butters and conditioners to oils, Decolonize has you covered from head to toe. Make your next purchase of skincare products from us at decolonize.com, or if you're in the DC metro area, you can purchase from us in person. Hands off Uhuru, hands off Africa. The trial date has been set, and the fight is now to support the Uhuru 3 in our fight against U.S. indictments, defend the African freedom struggle, defend the Uhuru movement, defend the African liberation struggle. Find out how you can support. Go to handsoffuhuru.org. And you can volunteer with us. If you've enjoyed tonight's program and would like to help us produce shows in 2024, volunteer with us. We're always looking for producers, interpreters, chat moderators for future broadcasts, and for our events and conventions. You can email info@anwouhuru.org if you'd like to share your skills. All right. Sorry. Okay, so Harriet's Daughter Book Club and Study Group. It's a monthly virtual discussion that centers around African liberation related literature. So for the month of May, we'll be finish discussing The War Before, the true life story of becoming a Black Panther, keeping the faith in prison and fighting for those left behind, by Sophia Bukhari. And the May book of the month, Women's Liberation and African Freedom Struggle, by Thomas Sankara. Next discussion, actually, I'm not sure when the next discussion will be, but you can visit anwouhuru.org/events to stay up to date of all upcoming international, national, and local events and programs. All right, I think that's it. Okay, all right. So those are our announcements, and there are some really great quotes in here. So I just wanted to share and comment some of them. Also, feel free to put some questions in the chat. Uhuru J, thanks for the history. The colonizer tries to, the gender construct. Yep, that is true. I love this one. So, by framing warmongers like Hillary Clinton as a feminist, they turn women and people more broadly to be anti-feminists, i.e., any Hillary Clinton. Yeah, so I mean, by framing people like Hillary Clinton as feminists, it's really pointing to the fact that like the feminist movement is the co-opted women's liberation movement. And if you're truly for women's liberation, you're not going to support a warmonger. You're not going to support somebody that is out here destroying countries all over the place, because when there's wars, when there's conflict, when there's strife, women and children are always hit the hardest. Women in particular, because they're in charge of the children, and they'll often give up food or water in order to preserve the life of their children. And so they have a responsibility not just for themselves, but for the family. And so when these conflicts and all these things happen, then they bear the brunt of the harm as a result of these conflicts that people like Hillary Clinton set up. And so they could sit here and try and that's another thing that's interesting, and I did not mention, but I meant to mention, was this idea of like imperial feminism, where they use different norms that other cultures might have. They use those other norms as an excuse to bring them democracy, for example. So they did that with Afghanistan. They were like, oh, look at the Taliban. The Taliban is oppressing women, which was true. Like, I would say, yes, the Taliban are oppressing women. We're oppressing women. And also, when the US came in, it's not like they weren't oppressing women. It's not like they weren't shooting up women and killing women's children. And, the starvation that happened as a result of the US stealing all of Afghanistan's money, like all of that hurt women. So to say like, oh, we're invading Afghanistan, when, they use that as one of the reasons, to liberate, women and give them a better life or whatever, and get rid of the Taliban, when in fact they made things worse. The things were actually better under the Taliban for a lot of women than they were under US imperialism. It also has me thinking about just the Middle East in general, how that's often used as a framing that we need to like go in there and liberate people. And meanwhile, a lot of those countries, thinking about, for example, Iran, they had a leftist revolutionary government, and you can Google online these old pictures of Iran where the women are wearing short skirts and they're like just looking like normal women in the 60s. And the US overthrew those governments that were supporting women's liberation. They overthrew those governments. And then they instilled these, repressive religious governments instead. And so when they're sitting here and talking about how we need to liberate women and we need to do this, we need to do that because of these oppressive governments, they are the reason why those oppressive governments exist to begin with. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up around the warmongers like Hillary Clinton. There's another comment. The invention of women making an African sense of Western gender discourse. Oh, I've heard of that, but I have not read it yet, and I'm definitely interested to check that out. Yeah, it sounds like an interesting book. Yeah, so another quote, "Thank you so much for the study. The African International's perspective on this topic is much needed these days." Yeah, that's very true. And also, the history of the Philippines is a clear example of the heinous nature of the colonial mode of production, so much so that the very language was co-opted by the Spanish. That also reminds me about how the first gay marriage that ever happened in the Philippines was by the Philippine Liberation Army. The Philippine Liberation Army has an entire queer division, and they have these like non-binary and gender fluid people that are um, basically revolting against the the neo-colonialism happening there, and their part of their resistance is also in how they express their gender and how they have relationships, and so they very much tie that together, fighting the colonial mode of production and also um, you know enforcing their own sense of identity and rather than just adopting the identity that was forced onto them. Um, yes, Viva Chiapas. That's where the Zapatistas are from. Um, and let's see. So we have once it is understood that European colonialism is the primary contradiction facing the world today, we can understand that all social contradictions stem from that root. Yes, that is 100% true. And that's the thing is that, you see a lot of these like white feminists that are out here and they're trying to say that like patriarchy is the primary thing that we have to worry about. And it's like, obviously, we live in a society where men are given preferential treatment in a specific way as a result of European colonization, and also, like I said, it's a result of European colonization. And if we want to fight the inequality between the genders, if we want to fight for women's liberation, we can't do that in the capitalist colonial context. Like it will always rely on specific hierarchies, including a gender hierarchy. So if we want to fight against women's oppression, then we have to look at European colonialism. We have to fight it because, like you said, it is the primary contradiction facing us. Yeah, let's see. So to be for queer liberation is to be for Black power. Yes, I would say so. I mean, it's not like sometimes when you say stuff like this, people are like, "Oh, are you like talking bad about straight people or whatever?" So obviously that is not the case. But I think it's important to think about how the majority of a lot of the gender liberation in terms of non-binary and trans identities, like a lot of that liberation work was led for and by Black people. I mentioned Stonewall, I mentioned William Dorsey. A lot of those movements were part of them rejecting the colonial way of being. So thanks for mentioning that. Children have no rights. Yeah, it's 100% true as a result of that hierarchy. There's God right up here, and man and woman. And then there's actually, I've seen this comic, and I don't know, maybe people have seen it before, where basically a capitalist is berating a worker. He's sitting there, he's like, rah, in this comic, sitting there berating the worker. And then, the worker, you see the worker and he has his hand up like he's about to hit his wife in the next panel. And so he's berating her and he's offloading his stress that the capitalists put on him onto the wife. And then you see the wife, she is spanking the child. And so she is offloading, her, anxiety and her angst as a result of gender depression onto the poor child. And then you have the last panel is the child yelling at a kitten, and it's like, it's kind of funny and it's kind of cute, but I think it also really expresses like how a lot of the conflicts that we see in our society happen. They're the results of capitalism and the stresses and the oppression that capitalism trickles down to all different types of people. From the capitalist to the worker man, from the worker man to the woman, and the woman to the child, and then the child to maybe an animal or another child that's even smaller than them. And so it's this like cascading effect of oppression that happens. Um, let's see. Comrade Je Amaechi would a discussion of the invention of women making an African make the invention of women making an African sense of Western gender discourses by Oyeronke Oyewumi be productive. I mean, I'm always down to read books, and it seems, I mean, I'm judging a book by its title, but it seems interesting. I definitely think I'll check it out. I think it could be an interesting read. I don't know if it'd be. I guess after I read it, I'll know whether or not it's worth discussing. But I think that at least the topic itself, in the title, is worth discussing. So I'm definitely interested in checking that out. And or perhaps also like Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, a Black Asexual Lens on Our Sex Obsessed Culture by Sharonda J. Brown. That's another thing that's interesting too, is there's so many different variations of not just gender but also sexuality, and those variations of sexuality include asexuality. And asexuality in particular is definitely a threat to the colonial order because, colonial order needs workers. And if people are asexual, they might not be having children. And if they're not having children to basically replace, the endless stream of workers that are, disabled or killed or, all as a result of their oppressive conditions, if they don't have that endless stream of workers, then they would have to start making conditions better for the current workers in order to, to increase their longevity, which of course they don't want to do. They want us to be disposable. They want us to just, they want like, they want a lot of children so they can replace the workers that they see as disposable. And so you see now a lot of these countries, including the U.S., but Europe, in Korea and Japan, I mean, they're freaking out because they don't have this new labor force coming in, and they have an aging labor force that is aging out of working. And then the younger generation is not having kids. I read an article that talked about how in one town in Korea, there was not a single first grader, not a single one. And so there's this movement called the 4B movement. It's basically Korean women that are boycotting men. And they've decided that they're not going to date men until the conditions for Korean women get better. And so we're seeing this huge drop in the fertility rates in Korea. And it's having this enormous effect to the point where, like I said, there was an entire preschool, like an entire kindergarten with not a single 5-year-old. And by the way, this movement is about 5 years old. So, correlation doesn't equal causation, but I think, it's pretty likely, it's probably likely that this 4B movement has something to do, this 4B movement that was started 5 years ago has something to do with the fact that there's a lot of classes in schools, elementary schools right now that have 0 5-year-old children, 0. And so, yeah, they're very scared of that. They are not into that. Firm gender roles are also in non-colonial cultures. Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, it's not to say that like every African, every non-colonial culture has like gender fluidity. It's just to say that the way that roles are defined specifically is in a way that supports the colonial mode of production. And there's other places, there's non-colonial cultures that had firm gender roles, but those gender roles were not the gender roles that necessarily exist today in the colonial mode of production. And so, yeah, it's true that there were plenty of places that had firm gender roles, and also those gender roles might not have looked the same um, as the gender roles in colonized cultures. Like, for example, in a lot of cultures, specifically in continental African cultures, um, there's women run the markets, women do the selling, and women do the farming. Like, those are traditional gender roles. Like, that is the way it has always been, and that's pretty much the way it's always going to be. Like, I remember I was visiting in Ghana cocoa farmers, and they're all women. And, I asked, I was like, it's interesting that there's all women, I was just asking, because I was curious. And, I asked if men ever do it. And they kind of laughed. Like, they were like, this is like, they were like, men farming? Like, psh. But think about, like, how the US has been functioning for a long time. Men doing the hard labor, men doing the work in the fields, men going to the market, going to the workplace. But even in cultures where there are firm gender roles, they don't look the same as the gender roles that are forced on us. So the point is to interrogate, where's my understanding of gender coming from? Like, is this something that is imposed onto me, or is it something that actually aligns with my culture or who I am as a person, or whatever? So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I think that it is important to mention that, yes, there are plenty of non-colonial cultures that have firm gender roles, but that doesn't mean those roles are the same as the firm gender roles that exist in colonial cultures. It's even in the Old Testament. Oh yeah, I mean, the Bible has been used to reinforce gender roles for a very, very long time. And, the Bible was used as a tool to oppress people, indigenous people. That was their reasoning why they were exterminating a lot of indigenous folks. I mentioned that there was this group of 40 men who were gender fluid that were fed to dogs, and they use the Bible and they use God as their reasoning for doing these, like, horrific things. And because, according to their beliefs, this is deviance, and it's evil, and it's demonic, and all these things. So yeah, I mean, the Old Testament says a lot of things, but I personally, I'm not a Christian. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with Christianity. I think a lot of good has come out of liberation theology. I've studied liberation theology, and it's been a powerful tool in anti-capitalist movements, specifically in Latin America. So I definitely am not 100% like the Bible's bad or anything. And also, we have to recognize that the Bible that we read has been constructed in a very specific way. Like, it was not like it just showed up on someone's doorstep. There are books in the Bible that are not in our, normal Bible. There's the King James version, which King James did all sorts of crazy things to the Bible. So, the Bible is not like a neutral tool. It's not like a neutral book. It is something that has been changing throughout the years. It is something that has adapted over time, and it's something that can and has been used as a tool of oppression, but also it's been something that has been used as a tool of liberation. So again, I mentioned binary thinking at the beginning of the this session, and I mentioned it because this sort of binary thinking, not even talking about gender binaries, just in general, binary thinking just removes a lot of the nuance. And so, a binary thinking might say, like, the Bible is this way, and so therefore it's good, or the Bible is that way, and therefore it's bad. And I say that it's not that simple, and that the Bible is a tool of, and it could be used in positive ways, and it could be used in negative ways, just like any tool. And so, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yes. So next book club, Harriet's Daughter Book Club. I forgot the date, so here's the date: July 21st. They're discussing part 1 of They Were Her Property. which is a really interesting book. I have not read it, but I have heard a lot about it, and it talks about how slavery was sort of presented and acted as kind of, in a way, not liberatory, but like a empowerment. It empowered a lot um, of colonizers, women colonizers. So these women back in the day, if there weren't slaves, they would be the ones doing a lot of that work. And so because they had slaves, they had property as human beings as property. They were free to do what they wanted, and it gave them freedom that they had never had in that society before. So it's interesting. The plight of gays is not equal to the plight of Black people. And again, that's a binary. So it's not gays versus Black people. It's like gays an identity that also features Black people, and depending on how many identities that you hold, you could have different types of oppression. So depending on the environment, obviously, but oftentimes, queer Black people are oppressed more than cisgender heterosexual people. The average lifespan of a Black trans woman is 38 years old. 38. Most Black trans women do not make it to 40. And so, you can say that, like, the plight of trans people is not equal to the plight of Black people, which is true, because that doesn't make sense, because they're sort of identities. But you can't say that the plight of, for example, a cishet person is the same as a trans woman, because that's just like not the facts. And so trans white people, though, and gay white people have a lot more rights in some areas than Black people. So again, it's not necessarily like a binary. It really depends on racial categories. It depends on class. Like Caitlyn Jenner has a lot more rights than probably all of us. Because not only she's white, but she's also in this ruling class, like this capitalist class. And so it's just not that simple. But I appreciate the comments. Let's see. My mind, Ella Baker was asexual. I don't know. I guess, I never even thought about that. But I guess I don't think, was she married? I don't think she was. But yeah, that's interesting. I never really even thought about that. And one thing I was thinking of is and I'm really into astrology. And in astrology, they often talk about creative energy. And creative energy can be actual physical children, like that you create, but it can also be other things like your work, your art, your movement. And so I feel like Ella Baker really like birthed a movement. Like the movement was her child in a way. And I think she might have had children. I think she did maybe, but I don't know. So just something to think about. I think Jesus the man was quite radical and would be against much of what the Gospels were used for. That's totally true. I think that's true as well. One thing that I think is interesting is how, you might have known that there's a lot of Korean Christians. You see Korean like Baptist churches a lot and stuff like that. And for me, I was like, that's so random. But I found out that the idea that that anybody can repent and go to heaven was revolutionary to the Koreans, because their belief system at the time was strict hierarchy that existed from the day you're born to the day you die. So the idea that like we're all equal under God was radical, and as a result of that, those Korean Christians like rejected the imperial order and formed a whole new society. And so, I think that the Jesus and parts of the Bible are definitely radical. It can be used as a tool for liberation, as well as it can be used for a tool of oppression. Again, it's a tool. We're getting close to the end, but Bakla, gay trans used to be leaders in community in the Philippines. Now are hairdressers and marginalized in economy. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing too, is we often see the queer and trans community that are marginalized in the economy. They can't get work. They're often turning to sex work and underground industries in order to make ends meet. And this is another reason why often their lives end very short. Their lives are very short. And I feel like this is a great way to end our night. We need all African people to be free. Yes, 100%. Regardless of what your gender is and what your sexuality is, all African people deserve freedom, and we need to be fighting for all African people, not just some African people, but all of us. So with that, I will say goodnight and thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And yeah, hope everyone enjoys their weekend.